Can I go here too or not?
Good morning, everyone. It's Dave and Robin here. We're coming to you from our writing cabin, as you can see. It was quite a feat trying to figure out how to make this work with the lighting in here because it's windows all around. But it's a special place to us and a place that we feel God. And special because Dave built it for me. All right, let's see if we can get you up on the screen here. For some reason, it's not showing. Oh, strange. List view. I don't know why it's not showing, Dave. It always shows here. All right, well, good morning. And we're talking this morning about, is pain skidding you sideways? Finding tender mercy during coronavirus. And I think we might need to define that word skidding. And I don't know, we were in the wilderness last week, thanks to so many people who listened in as we talked about wilderness spirituality. But I remember an ATV going right behind us as we were talking. And I was thinking about our friend who skidded off a trail. And what happens when you skid? Maybe if people aren't familiar with that term, or if it's I don't know if it's an American term.
Well, basically it's sliding sideways. And of course, professionals can do it. And sometimes dirt track racers can do it quite effectively. But for the average person, a skid means you're losing control. And oftentimes it means it seldom is straight. Usually there's wavering in it. There's usually you're going sideways, you're going every which way. It's an out of control movement that can potentially be the precursor to a crash.
Ouch, I don't think I want to skid. Well, first of all, before we get too deep into this, I just want to give a shout out. You see these beautiful mugs we have this morning? Nicoletta Koha sent us a box full of goodies yesterday from Nantucket Island, including mugs and books and shells and a CD. So thank you, Nicoletta. We have new mugs for our morning Facebook Live. But it's interesting because Dave brought me this article yesterday. I get a magazine called Psychotherapy Worker. And there's an article in there this time called Finding the Balance, How to Meet Stress with Tenderness During COVID-19. And this is by David Treadway. And he says, I'll just read from the article. He says, we also need to understand that for many couples and families, and I'd say singles too, and frankly for me too, all the intense fear, sadness, and agitation is frequently coming out sideways. It is really the case that a disagreement about whose job it was to clean up the kitchen. Oh, is it really the case that a disagreement about whose job it was to clean up the kitchen is the cause for rage and even threats of divorce? We're faced with an invisible enemy, one who we can't really fight or flee. Is it any wonder that this energy can explode in a moment's notice with our beloved spouse or child? He's a marriage counselor, so he's talking about it in the context of marriage. But yesterday afternoon, I was skidding sideways, wasn't I, honey?
I think you may have been skidding a little bit.
I was skidding, and you're going to find out more why as we talk. But when you skid I'll call it the Rona skid, because people like to affectionately call coronavirus the Rona. So we'll talk about the Rona skid. I had the Rona skid going on, and I was bumping into Dave. I was skidding sideways into him, and I'm like, this house has too much stuff in it, and the garage is a mess, and nobody's cleaning up their dishes, and it's just kind of on a Rona rant. We'll call it a Rona rant. Doing the Rona rant. I had a Rona rant going on, and I'm like, I think I said, Dave, I'm just grumpy. Please don't take this personally, which is hard not to when I'm bumping into him and I'm skidding into him. I think his response was really a tender one. He went out and tried to do one of the things I've been wanting him to do. So that was really sweet, honey, to go out there and try to fix the garbage for me.
No worries.
But I think there are times that you've skidded into me as well.
Oh, yeah.
I don't think I'm the only skidder in this family.
No. And there's never been a threat of divorce. We've never had the threat of divorce. However, there have been times of tension and times when our response toward each other was exaggerated. It wasn't.
Yes.
Was beyond the normal.
Yeah.
It was a little bit out of control compared to what it usually is.
Yeah, yeah. And so we go sideways with our pain, and we can even go sideways with other people's pain. In other words, we're bumping into their pain, and we don't have the usual empathy, compassion, kindness. We may be more tempted to rebuke or to, hey, what's wrong with you? Like, because their pain feels like too much. A few weeks ago, I did a Facebook Live on Are You Too Much? And boy, did that get a response. So many of you feel like too much. So if we feel like too much, other people can feel like too much. It all feels like too much. And before you know it, we're doing the coronavirus slide, the Rona slide into each other. And we're going sideways with our pain, and it's causing us shame and relational pain.
Yeah, certainly. After we've had one of these episodes, as our right mind kicks back in, we feel terrible. Like, wow, I should have handled that better. I should have been more patient. I should have been less spoken and said less. And then, of course, that gives the accuser an opportunity to heap shame on us for why can't we overcome these little tendencies we have? Why can't we ever say the right thing? Why can't we have better self-control? He opens the door for accusations to come, which are really not accurate, but in the moment, he's got a point, and he tries to drill it home, but that's not really what God's point is for us. Oh, there we are.
There we are. I found it. I had to change back into the old Facebook so we could see you guys. I don't want to skid. Yes. Oh, thank you. Someone just complimented me on my hair. Well, that's very nice. It says, can so relate to a home being too full. Haha. So kind of Dave to help out in the moment. Yes, Dave was helpful in the moment. And so his whole point in the article as a therapist is that he says, first of all, he teaches his clients to be skillfully fearful. In other words, when the skid starts going, to have skills to apply. And we're going to talk some about that today, what those skills might look like. But also, he says, we just need plain out tenderness.
It's interesting because I went through a couple drivers training courses in my previous job. We drove a lot, and they hired professionals to train us how to be safe. And one of the instruments they used was called a skid car.
A skid car.
Skid car.
Okay.
And it would especially set up the suspension to make it more skiddable than other cars. And we purposely went into skids in this car to learn the skills we needed in case in real life, in our daily day situation, we went into a skid in our car.
So maybe what I was really doing was getting some new skills yesterday when I was skidding into you. And here's the good news: is coronavirus is skidding us all over the place. And with that there's a chance that we could be developing new skills, and we could learn to be, as he says, skillfully fearful, skillfully skidding, skillfully kind of whacking out. We could learn skills during coronavirus that apply to so many things. So I found this scripture that I thought would be so appropriate today. It says, so Lord, don't hold back your love or withhold your tender mercies from me. Keep me in your truth and let your compassion overflow to me no matter what I face. Evil surrounds me. Problems greater than I can solve come one after another.
Wow. Without
you, I know I can't make it. Evil surrounds me. Problems greater than I can solve come one after another. And just the news right now is crazy, isn't it? Have you guys read some of the stuff going on? Oopsie, I accidentally switched us out of it. I don't even know how I did that. Bear with us because, as you know, we're not the most techie people in the world. Okay, there we go. But I read an article about a man who went in his elevator and a man jumped in after him, all in black, because the camera showed it later. And went up to his apartment, assaulted him, and his sister came and found his body parts all over his apartment.
Good
And
night.
I'm like, why did I read that? And now you're like, why did you share that? Sorry, guys. Sorry for the sensitive. Just wipe that out of your mind. But he was saying in the article, we need to really moderate our news intake because it just feels like the news is accentuating all the evil and all the problems, and they're problems greater than us, and they come one after the other, and nobody knows what's going to solve it. And just when we think it's better, like Idaho has just soared in coronavirus cases, and it's been scary.
Yeah, no doubt. Certainly, there is so much in our present culture that's worthy of grieving over, that it's more grief than any one of us can handle. And if we don't regulate that, it can affect us. It does affect us. There's no doubt that in our sensitive brain, we were not created to handle this much bad news at once.
Yeah, Kathy says, I've kept my mouth shut many times for fear of skidding, although it's produced unhealthy limitations on my communication. Yeah, sometimes we're biting our lips, aren't we, Kathy? We're just biting our lips not to say something. But yet, we don't want to freeze out our communication either. And so we need tender mercy.
New people coming on?
Yeah, we have some new people coming on. And as you come on today, we're talking about, is your pain skidding you sideways? And Steve Habercorn says you're going to make skidding jokes, but you're going to abstain, aren't you?
Of course. And happy birthday, Steve.
Happy birthday, Steve. Is your pain skidding you sideways, finding tender mercy during a coronavirus? We did a brave exercise the other night we're doing some small group trauma training. And if you didn't get in on this run, you could get in on another run. And, one thing that he was saying in the article is deep dives may not be advisable right now. Well, we took a deep dive.
Yeah.
And that we did this exercise of taking a traumatic memory and unwinding it by asking yourself the questions, by journaling about these questions. What happened to you? What did you think? What did you see? What did you hear? What did you feel? And I don't know, Dave, do you want to tell about what you came up with and what you processed during that exercise?
Sure. And remember, a trauma is not always the extent of what happened to you. It's more, what do you still carry with you? And so by some extent, people would probably say, oh, Dave, that was nothing compared to my trauma. It doesn't matter the extent of what happened. It's the extent of what you carry with you that matters. And for me, it was a childhood situation where, as a young boy, or probably 4 years old, 5 years old, it was a family reunion, and I was playing outside, and there was a whole bunch of the men of the family were all on the front porch in my grandma's house, and I noticed that the sidewalk was falling apart. And so I thought, these pieces should not be this way. It shouldn't be this broken up piece of concrete. And I started removing some of these broken up pieces in an effort in my 4-year-old mind to help. So you
were tearing apart the sidewalk.
I was just taking the pieces that were already broken and pulling them off to the side.
Yes.
So I figured that's what you do. With broken pieces, you sweep them up and you stick them away. But that's not the way my father or maybe the other men saw it. They saw it as being destructive. And next thing you know, my dad comes sweeping off the front porch, grabs me up, says some words, "What are you doing?" or something, harsh words, and then threw me in the back of our station wagon. It had a big back window, and it was open, thankfully, and he threw me through the opening onto what was a feather tick. It was looks like a massive pillow, and thankfully it was a soft landing. And I laid there and just was abandoned to sort it out in my own mind. And in my own mind, I'm thinking, what did I do? What's wrong? And I cried. I just wanted to hide. I wanted to just nestle into that feather tick and hide. And that's what I did until finally someone came and got me to take me to supper. But I remember this very vividly, one of my very earliest memories, and certainly the shame that went with it.
What did you see? What did you see when you brought back up the memory?
I definitely saw that open back window, I could see the pieces of concrete. I could see my dad coming at me. I could see myself flying through the air, through the window, into that feather tick. And after that, I was just kind of surrounded by this big pillow. And that's where I just buried and hid and wept.
And wept. And what were the men doing on the porch?
They just went about their conversation. Of course, I feared that they were all thinking about me or talking about me.
Mm-hmm.
But probably they were just talking about cornfields or whatever was going on in Illinois at the time. But I felt very separated and very much the disapproval of the whole group.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing. Everybody out there, thank Dave for sharing.
Mm-hmm.
A very intimate memory for him. So what we did to counter that, for those of you just joining, wow, a bunch of you just joined, we're talking about is pain skidding you sideways, tender mercy during coronavirus. And Dave just shared a very traumatic memory from his childhood. We'll repost after this so you can hear. But what we did, we were doing a small group trauma exercise, and where we were each taking one traumatic memory and processing again, what happened to you? What do you think? What did you see? What did you hear? What did you feel? So we invited 3 people to share, and everybody else was supposed to be Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
So this is what made this doable, to be honest, is we all became Jesus. In our very best way, we tried to shift into being Jesus and be curious. So, and then try to feel what Jesus might have felt. And then we had a chance to say to each other, to say to the person who shared what we think, what we would say as Jesus.
Right.
And Dave, this is Jesus speaking.
Okay. Hi, Jesus.
Hi. I want you to know that I kind of agree with you about that sidewalk. That sidewalk needed to be replaced, by the way. And I admired your ingenuity in the moment and thought about how I might use that gift later on, that you'd be building things and putting things together. And even this writing cabin you're sitting in, that I would help you and instruct you how to build that, because you had that in you. And I just wanted you to know that when you were thrown into the back of that station wagon and treated so coldly, I was there. I was there, seeing you, hearing you, mourning with you, sad with you, you know, a little unhappy with your dad over that, but I knew he had his own issues. But yet I saw the man you were going to become, and my heart felt the pain, but my heart also felt the joy of this resilient man you were going to become.
Amen. And my dad ultimately trained me in many of those skills and became my greatest mentor. But in that moment, I think he was feeling embarrassment and felt like he needed to do something in front of the men to show his disapproval.
Do you think he skidded? Would you call that a full-out skid?
He probably was skidding.
Your dad
he probably was
skidded?
skidding, because ultimately he was a very supportive dad.
Yeah. And we also call this the voice of grace, you know, as a way, some people are saying, thanks for sharing, Dave. We also call this the voice of grace, but really all of us went into Jesus. Now, some of us got really triggered, and then you find yourself flipping back into yourself and just hearing the story. And then you're like, whoa, wait, I'm supposed to be Jesus. Let me go back into Jesus, because Jesus is a safe place to hear traumatic memories from. And there were some very traumatic memories that were shared during that session, like childhood sexual abuse and all kinds of things. You know, I was thinking, Dave, how traumatic memories live in the body. Can you explain that?
Well, certainly in the brain, for sure. But also, it's interesting, and what we've been learning as we study more about trauma is that it goes beyond the brain. It comes down oftentimes in the lower body, in the hips. And so I don't think anyone really totally understands it, but there's a book out we've mentioned before called The Body Keeps the Score.
Yeah.
And somehow it just happens that these traumatic events, you feel them sometimes in your gut, you feel them sometimes in your legs, because they're part of the amygdala response, part of the fight or flight response, which is there, it's left in your body, so that in a case of something that is an emergency that needed to be responded to instantly, the body can respond faster. It didn't have to be processed through the brain. It can be processed instantly because the body keeps a memory for our protection. But unfortunately, that memory can also serve to re-traumatize us and skid us sideways.
You know, it's interesting because we try to think ourselves out of trauma or think ourselves out of our pain, right? We try to think ourselves out, but we can't really think ourselves out because of this very fact it's in our body. And in a sense, we need a bodily response.
Right.
And I think God knew this because one of the first early stories I thought of was the Israelites in Egypt. And think of the trauma that was in their bones. I got to believe they were skidding sideways all over the place. I mean, you've got the shame that the Egyptians threw on them. You're lazy, you're worthless, you're lower than us, so you are going to do the dirty work. You're going to do the work that no respectable human being should do because you're not even human beings. You're slaves. So you're going to do this terrible work. I imagine they were called lazy. We know that they beat them. We know that it was cruel, the oppression. And I think there was this above, below, like we are above, we are the authority, you know, we provide your food, so you will slave for us. And if you don't, you'll pay. And we can say whatever we want to you, you know, we can skid into you all we want. And you better just say, yes, sir, and keep building for us and keep making those bricks and keep doing this. And so you've got to believe that as an imperfect, traumatized people, the Israelites' pain went out sideways.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Sometimes it came out towards their leaders. Sometimes it came out towards one another. Mm-hmm. But obviously God did things to help them heal things that were physical. Providing manna. Sometimes he uses a good fellowship meal to help us heal. And other times they worship. That's a bodily. We sing out loud. We shout to the Lord. These are physical things we can do. David danced before the Lord with all his might. These were physical manifestations of God's presence that ultimately could lead to healing.
Yes, yes. And I think, you know, I started thinking you even see this in the Ten Commandments. Like God knew they would skid, so that it was like the skid car, you know, it was like the anti-skidding instructions. You know, they needed new ways to deal with pain, to seek God instead of idols, to not go act out sexually with people they weren't married to, you know, to seek things and start to use them as satisfaction once they got their stuff back and once they marched out with all that booty. You got to think that was kind of written. It was almost a healing guide for trauma, you know, is in a strange kind of way.
Well, I think the walking through the Red Sea, obviously that walk was physical and they could see things around them physical. And that was important that they had those walks. And then, of course, God did not allow their shoes to wear out. Another physical manifestation of God that could bring them comfort. But those things were body things along with spiritual things.
Yeah. And I think, you know, just even like you said, walking through the Red Sea, and Grace calls we have 12 stones. And the reason is that very story, because after they walked through the divided water, God knew he was dealing with people who had a lot of pain and that were going to skid all kinds of directions. And so he's like, go back in, take one man from each tribe and get a stone. And I imagine them carefully picking those stones, you know, that spoke to their experience. Maybe somebody got a jagged one and said, this is how Egypt was for me.
Right.
You know,
that was after the second crossing.
Yeah, after the second crossing, yeah. When he went back and they went back and got the stones, and then they built an altar. And that altar, what was it called, honey?
Gilgal.
And what does that mean?
It's a stone of remembrance. It's a stone of that reminds them of God's presence.
And so he said, call this place Gilgal because I've rolled away all your shame. So what happens is in the skid, there's shame. Haven't you experienced? That's the first thing I felt after I skidded into Dave yesterday is shame. There's shame in the skid. And even if someone else skids into us, we feel shame. I think it's not just the shame of our own skids. It's someone else skidding into us. You know, I shared in our group, and those of you who are just joining us, thank you so much for coming. We're talking about, is your pain skidding you sideways? and how psychotherapists are saying that is what happens with coronavirus, is the pain is making us skid into each other, and we start to think each other are the problem.
Yeah, misplaced aggression.
Misplaced aggression, yeah. And I had a bunch of misplaced aggression yesterday. So if you've done that, don't feel alone. It's human to skid and to skid into each other. But so we're using this small group trauma healing that we did the other night as kind of an example of this, about what do you do with the skid then, and how can tender mercy be there in the skid when you skid into someone or someone skids into you. And so I developed this exercise for the trauma group, and honestly, it wasn't one that I was taught. It wasn't one I learned in my certification. It was one I made up, but it was actually inspired by Sarah Falusco and some empathy training she gave the Northwest leaders at a retreat that we've used with married couples, right and left. And so that was to take a traumatic memory and look at it and ask, what happened? What did you think? What did you see? What did you hear? What did you feel? And God really put a deep one on my heart to process. And that was when I was about, maybe 20. I don't even think I was that old, maybe 18. I was working at a institution that helped people with mental disabilities. And I was working, I had a little office, I had my own office, and it had a counter, and the doctors would come in and give me orders. I was in charge of transportation. And so a doctor came in and closed the door behind him, which was kind of weird because I always kept the door open. And he asked me to come around. He said he wanted to show me something. So I had to walk around the counter and come stand beside him to look at the chart. And just in seconds, he had me pinned against the wall. And trying to pull off my clothes. And so what I thought was, no, stop. I don't want to do this. No, leave me alone. Stop. And he had my arms pinned, and I was trying to wrestle my arms out. What did I see? It was a blur, like a blur of colors, I saw his white coat, and I felt his wet lips trying to kiss me. I felt his, the wetness of his lips. And I remember seeing my purse and thinking, I have to get out of here. What did I hear? I heard nothing. And I felt so alone in that moment. I felt utterly and completely alone, like no one hears, no one cares. And I'm fighting with all my might to get him off of me. And I'm feeling despair and shame. And finally, I get my arms free and give him a giant shove and startle him. And I grab my purse and get out the door. And I'm half running down the hallway, and he's chasing me, trying to get my phone number. And I'm like, the words won't even come. I'm like, no. And I never went back to that job again. But it was surprising to me because you can hear the emotion in my voice. I've never processed it in quite that way before. And so I was sitting in the writing cabin before our seminar, and I was shaking like a leaf, with the memory of this sexual assault and just where his hands were and what he was touching and, and pulling, and had a dress on and just that utter helplessness, in the moment. And then the fear, and then the rage, and then the adrenaline to get out of there. And then, Dave, let's let what we talked about is in the group, the way, you may think, why did you do that in the middle of coronavirus, have everybody process these really intimate memories? But the thing was, that memory needed tender mercy. And so everybody else was trying to be Jesus and be ready to respond as Jesus would. So Jesus, are you here?
Yes, I'm here.
You're here. Are you here in that memory?
I'm a little angry right now.
Are you?
I'm very angry. But I was there, and I was angry then too. I saw your helplessness. I saw your desire to be righteous. I just saw your felt all your emotions, and I helped you see your purse. I helped you see your purse and helped you have enough consciousness to escape. And I gave you the strength to push someone off of you that was probably much stronger than you. I gave you that strength to get you out of there, and I gave you the conviction and the oomph to quit that job. Those were all things that I was helping and inspiring you to do those things, because I don't ever want my children, my sister, treated that way, someone I love dearly. And so I'm sorry you had to go through that, but I'm thankful that I can now use you as a wounded healer, and you're helping so many other people through your voice and sharing your pain. And I really do admire you so much and love you so much.
I love you too, Jesus. Wow, that's so powerful, isn't it? And so the tender mercy makes that possible. Like, for those of you who are just joining us, I just shared a sexual assault that happened to me when I was 18 years old. And what I saw, thought, heard, felt, it's a trauma exercise that we've done in our groups. And Dave became Jesus, and Jesus helped me process what happened to me. And I think that a miracle happened in those groups, because then we unwound it, of course, with everybody. How did you feel? Are you okay? Because some people were sharing some of the very worst moments that they'd ever been through of, assault like me, or abuse, very dark moments. And, but yet, we were talking about curiosity and how Jesus has that curiosity, but we can learn curiosity is a function of tender mercy, isn't it? So What does curiosity do in the brain? How does it help us?
Well, in the brain, unfortunately, maybe there's a reason for this, obviously, in God's design, is that the amygdala does not have a direct link to the prefrontal cortex. It's designed probably to allow us to respond very quickly to emergency situations. However, the connection between our trauma and our ability to think is limited because of this. But in God's design, He gave us another part, the medial cortex, and there's other names. It's a very complicated process, but it allows us, it mediates, it translates. And so to get those logical, spiritual, wise things from up here into the emotional part of the brain, what we need to do is be curious, and that activates our medial cortex, and then that allows us to get perspective, to get wisdom, to get the comfort we need in those moments. But this is a learned skill. Just like when we did a skid car, I talked about using a skid car in training, driver's training. What they teach you is to turn into the skid.
Ah, yes.
Turn into the skid, which is counterintuitive. And oftentimes, it's counterintuitive for us to turn into our skids. We want to hide. We want to somehow block them out. We want to run away because we're embarrassed or ashamed. But what Robin has been doing this morning, and what she was doing last night, was actually turning into the skid and facing it, being curious about it, trying to understand where it came from, and then working on the healing process. This is a skill that will be very, very helpful as we all try to deal with our traumas and our everyday pains.
Yeah. Well, let's take one more example before. Let's see how we are on time. I don't even know how long we've been going here.
About 30 minutes.
30 minutes. Okay.
35 minutes.
35 minutes. But we were thinking another great example of this from the Bible is Paul. And we don't always think of Paul and trauma, do we? Especially before he was a Christian. We know he had a lot of trauma just for being a Christian, a lot of suffering, a lot of beatings, a lot of misunderstanding, huge amount of trauma he suffered after he became a Christian, which should tell us we shouldn't be surprised if we suffer relational trauma after we become a Christian. Paul did, Peter did, different characters in the book of Acts did. There were conflicts, there were things they had to work through. We suffer afterwards. But I thought of Paul and how he was largely used to under-over relationships. And he probably spent enough time in under relationships that when he earned his way into the over, man, he liked it there. He was a Pharisee of Pharisees. But I think all that having to earn his status was a trauma in and of itself. I mean, he couldn't value himself except through the law and through what he knew and through how he executed it. And so that's all he had to protect himself. And who knows about his childhood, how, what went on and what kind of expectations were on him for perfection. And so he learned to protect himself and shield himself. And so even religiosity can bear this kind of stuff.
No doubt. As a Pharisees, there's a lot of control there, a lot of rules, a lot of perfectionism, a lot of things that could leave you feeling very empty, feeling very inadequate, and even feeling angry. And so then, of course, as he persecuted Christians, there's also trauma that comes in causing other people trauma. And so that whatever trauma was there before was compounded by his persecution of Christians.
So I think what Paul was doing was he was in a full out skid, in his persecuting others. He was mistaking his own stuff and their vulnerability, their joy, their simplicity, their extolling Jesus, who he'd been taught, was a liar or not the truth. All of that drove him crazy. But what he didn't realize was because he was hurt, he was hurting others. And Jesus cut right to the point when he appeared to him and said, Paul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?
Exactly.
Yeah, so then after Jesus came, think of what God did. He blinded him. And so now Paul had to learn to let other people shield him. He couldn't use his eyes. He couldn't use his learning. He couldn't use the law. He couldn't use all this stuff he relied on. Someone else had to teach him. Someone else had to feed him. Someone else had to maybe help him get dressed. Someone else had to make sure he didn't trip and hurt himself. He was totally thrust onto the tender mercy of other people. And that's what transformed Saul into Paul.
It's interesting. Some people speculate that Paul's thorn in the flesh might have been his eyesight. It might have been his eyesight. And if that's the case, or whatever it was, the answer for whatever his thorn in the flesh was my grace is sufficient, which would mean my affirming presence is sufficient. My power is made perfect in weakness. And so whatever his traumas were before becoming a Christian, after becoming a Christian, the answer for his trauma was the affirming presence of Jesus.
Yeah.
And I believe that's also our answer to trauma as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So what does all this have to do with coronavirus? And, I wanted to kind of wrap this up and just tell you what happened to me day before I skidded, the day after I shared my sexual assault in the trauma group, and that was a huge thing, and it's a huge thing for me to give it to so many of you today. But I trust you, as listening into this, I trust you, trust your hearts, and thank you for being Jesus for me. But I went to get blood taken, and I had a woman, I don't know, she was of a different culture, obviously. And I'm wanting to get in there and get out of there, right? I've got my mask on. I'm going into a sanitized waiting room. They've asked me 20 questions before they even let me in. I want in and I want out. And pretty soon I'm noticing I'm not going in. Other people are coming and they're putting them ahead of me. And I'm like, what's going on? So I went up to the window and I'm like, is there a problem? And she's like, this code on your lab sheet is confusing. And I'm thinking, this lab sheet, they've used the same code for the last 10 years. Every time I've had blood work for my thyroid, nobody's ever had trouble with it before, but I don't want to shame her. I'm just trying to understand. And she's like, we can't do it because we don't have stickers, and I can't have stickers until I understand the code. And she's skidding. She's full out skidding. So I'm like, okay. She's like, we'll get you as soon as we can get you. I'm like, okay. So, another person goes in. Finally, she calls me in. And I had seen her on the phone, so I'm just curious. And I'm like, I'm just curious, did you call my doctor? And she's like, look at this code. This code is not, da-da-da-da-da. And then she's wrapping it up as she's talking about the bad code. And she starts sticking it, and she can't find a vein. And she's like, you have roly veins. Your veins will not take the needle. Your veins don't want to give. Your veins, she's like shaming my veins. And finally she can't get a vein, and I think my veins maybe were repelled by all the shaming, who knows. But anyways, finally she's like, let me try one more time. And she stuck it in really deep and she still didn't get any blood. I'm like, please, can you change the other arm? So then she goes to the other arm And she wraps it up again, and she gets one needle. She says, it's too big. You have tiny veins. And then she got another, and then she got another, and she's like, this is a 23. Every time you come in, you need to tell them that your veins will only accept a 23. And I'm like floored by this whole experience, and trying to be a Christian, you know, trying to be curious. And finally she says, just so you know, this is not your fault. And I'm like, I didn't think it was my fault. And to me, it was like she was insinuating it was my fault. I'm like, why would you say that? She said, oh, people blame themselves for this kind of stuff. I'm like, oh. I'm like, well, just so you know, I don't blame you. So I think I was starting a skid there, a little bit of a skid. And then I tried to say something nice to her as I left, but I went and sat in the car, and I just felt like weeping. And I realized I felt so raw from the trauma exercise, and now I'm having this happen with her. And so here I want to give you a practical. David Vera, you are safe. Thank you. Thank you, David. I am safe. I'm safe. I went in the car, and I was feeling enormous shame that I wasn't bigger than this in my Christianity, that I didn't seem to have the right answers, you know, that I even asked all these questions to begin with, which there's trauma underneath that too. And I started feeling the accuser knocking on my door. And so what I did is I took a deep breath, rolled back my shoulders. I said, I'm safe. And then I tapped my heart and I said, pain, I'm glad you showed up today. You can show up, you know, and it was painful. And I'm glad you spoke. I'm glad you were there. You remind me that I'm human. You remind me that I hurt. You remind me that it's okay to feel pain. And you make me softer. So thank you for showing up. And then I tapped my head and I said, thank you, reasoning, for being here in this moment and reasoning me through this and helping me. And I all of a sudden I realized I was okay. I mean, not only okay, the rest of the day I felt a lot of joy. And that's why yesterday's skid was a little bit of a surprise. I didn't know where it came from exactly. I'm still figuring that one out. Maybe cumulative coronavirus stuff. But so, you know, I what I've learned is that in the skid, when you find yourself skidding, let the pain speak. You know, don't repress the pain. Don't try to skip the pain. Don't
turn into the skid.
Turn into the skid. Yes, turn into the skid. Lest the skid takes you off the road, like our friend who had the big ATV accident, and now he posted that he needs to have double surgery on his torn rotator cuff because he skidded off a path. He took a curve too fast. You know, allow the pain to speak. Turn into the skid. But don't allow the pain to have the whole conversation. Allow the PFC, you know what I mean? Then let the spirit speak. Let the reasoning speak. Remind yourself that you're safe. Remind yourself of who you are as a Christian. Remind yourself that you don't have to carry shame. And then you see, because if we put shame on the skids, what will happen next time we skid?
Go right off the road.
Going off the road. That's right. Every time the skids will get worse. So how do you guys skid, by the way? I would love to hear from you. You lots of words of affirmation. How do you guys skid as we're wrapping up? So let's go back to our scripture, Dave, and let that kind of, because we talked about Psalm. Do you want to read the whole Psalm 40, 11 through 13?
Sure. So, Lord, don't hold back your love or withhold your tender mercies from me. Keep me in your truth. Let your compassion overflow to me, no matter what I face. Evil surrounds me. Problems greater than I can solve come one after another. Without you, I know I can't make it. My sins are so many. I'm so ashamed to lift my face to you. For my guilt grabs me by the strings and stings my soul, and I am weakened and spent. Please, Lord, come quickly and rescue me. Take pleasure in showing me your favor and restore me.
So what keys do you see in there? What practicals do you see that we can leave everybody with? When you hit the skid of coronavirus, how does tender mercy make the difference?
Well, certainly he's taking it to God.
Yeah.
Certainly going to God. He's being honest to God. He's not watering it down. He's not sweetening it up. He's being very raw and honest with God about what he's feeling and his own shame. And he's talking about his feelings, not just some kind of a now I lay me down to sleep prayer. He's actually talking to God about what's going on in his heart and being totally transparent and open and about his pain as well. And I think that's a great place to start.
Yeah. And then he says, I think, key words, keep me in your truth. So here, and let your compassion here overflow to me. God brings us that perfect balance of heart, of being able to speak from the heart, speak our pain, and, conviction, truth, spirit,
Right.
that comes as we affect the PFC.
I think that prayer can also be a key way. Honest prayer like this can be a key way of being curious and activating the medial cortex and allowing the connection to come between our body and our soul.
So if you want to be in a trauma healing group, we do have some paid trauma groups. You can inquire about. We're in the middle of this run of them, but then we'll probably do another run of them. We've already got some people lining up.
And don't forget our website, purityrestored.com. purityrestored.com. All of our books are available there, and they are tools for healing, tools for grace. Mm-hmm. And there's also a place on every page, at the bottom of the page, a place you can donate to keep this ministry alive and going, which we appreciate very much.
Yeah, so is your pain skidding you into other people? Remember that the tender mercy is the answer. We need tender mercy to give to each other, give tender mercy to ourselves, and look for tender mercy from God.
And Jesus, his grace is sufficient, and we believe that his grace here is talking about his affirming presence, and that presence is tender mercy. And he had that with Saul, he had it with Paul, and he has it with us. And so if we will follow that example and let his grace be sufficient, his tender mercy, bask in it, sit in it, meditate on it, and let the tender mercy of dear friends reflect also to you that Jesus will use your friends and people who can empathize with you. He'll use those people, and he'll be in your midst as you talk and skid into your pain.
Alrighty. Thank you guys for being with us in our writing cabin this morning. Happy Saturday. Have a great day.